Hi there, welcome to today's Planner Session webinar, the A to Z of assessment, brought to you, of course, by Geneva Push. My name is Ben McKecken. I'm going to be your moderator today. And now, throughout our webinar, we encourage you to interact with our speakers. You can do that by typing in questions using the question pane in front of you. And we're going to get to answering your questions after the initial interview, but make sure you get your questions in early so we can make sure we get them through. And also, we're recording today's webinar, and we're going to send you a link to it so you can access it. We're going to send that to you within the next couple of days. And also, while on that point, you should go to genevapush.com and check out the huge resource, the archive resource there of Planner Session webinars. There are so many there to choose from, and they are fantastic to help with all your church planning needs. Now, before we get underway with the A to Z of assessment, just a quick thanks to our supporters who make the webinars possible. Firstly, I want to thank EA Insurance. We want to thank them because they've got behind the planner sessions all of this year. It's been great. If you haven't sorted out the insurance side of church planning, we highly recommend you start with a chat with EA. They'll help you sort out everything from public liability to building, property and contents insurance, as well as all that stuff you haven't even thought of yet. So go to ea.org.au. And we also really want to thank Christian Super. Now, this is obviously on the super side of church planning. Go to Christian Super for all of your super inquiries, super needs. What super, go to Christian Super. So you visit them at christiansuper.com.au. Right, now on to the A to Z of assessment. Today, our host is going to be Mikey Lynch. He's one of the directors at Geneva Push. And now, Mikey, I'm really keen to know what is going to turn up on the A to Z of assessment at Q and X. So take it away, Mikey.
Q and X, stay tuned for that. Yeah, we've got a whole Dr. Zeus prepared for you here, a lot of make-up words. Thanks for having us, good to have you guys here, and also a hello to all the people who are going to be listening to this into the future as well. Hello, future potential church planters. We hope this is a resource, is a helpful one to you. I want to introduce you to our two panelists, or interview subjects who are going to be talking us through this. These guys probably have 100 or more hours of assessment between them within Geneva. And we just want to hear from each of them. So first of all, let's kick off with Greg Lee, pastor of Hunter Bible Church. Greg, do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself, your family, ministry, passions? Let us get to know where you're coming from.
Yeah, so I'm married to Emma. We have 4 children. We're up here in Newcastle at a church called Hunter Bible Church. And we've been here now for 16 years. I think in terms of passions, it's funny, I think when you have 4 children, it's hard to have many passions outside of trying to get to sleep of the night.
I just saw a friend of mine who's an artist just linked to an Onion article on Facebook saying, find the thing that you love to do with all your heart and then do it on the weekends and late at night when you don't have much energy.
That's right. If someone can pay you to do it, then more for them. Yeah, that's right. And so I think at the stage where we're at, for family becomes the big passion. That's all we've got time for.
The ministry itself, I mean, what's the things that as you roll out of bed 16 years into Hunter Bible Church, what are some of the things that actually, you generally gets the blood flowing and the heart pumping and makes you go, yeah, that's why we're doing this?
It's funny, at the moment we're in a position where we've really been able to dig into exactly those questions. So we're in a deepest budget hole that we've ever had. So we're looking at a massive deficit by the end of this year. And the wonderful thing about that, the gift from God in that, is it makes you ask why we're doing what we're doing. And it's about reaching Newcastle for Christ. The idea that there's 300,000 people in Newcastle and 295,000 of them are going to hell is such a stark reality that as soon as things start to threaten reaching them, so, with a budget question, we're thinking, can we plant a congregation that we want to plant next year 20 minutes away? And it's a horrifying thought because people are going to hell. And so at the moment, having that crystallized by maybe we can't do it is really powerful. It's getting me out of bed bouncing around because, even though it feels like a crisis, it's about the most important things we're doing.
Yeah, so you're going to have to cut down those helicopter rides and stuff, I reckon. Is that...
Yeah, we're probably going to have to sell the HPC off
We'll be praying for you, Greg. Budget crises are stressful, but as you say, it's an awesome opportunity to reevaluate why you're doing stuff. We've also got Scott Sanders here, who's the executive director for Geneva Push. So I'm a director. Scott's the one who actually executes what the other directors are talking about, and you work very hard on that, Scott. So could you share with us a little bit about your ministry, family, passions?
Yeah, I grew up in a Christian family. And yeah, grew up going to church sort of twice on a Sunday, morning and evening with my dad in a Presbyterian church and my mum. I've grown up in Sydney and I've been working for Geneva Push over the last 6 years, and so there's been a growing passion there to see church planners equipped and strengthened. I'm married to Natalie, so I don't know if there's a photo of my family there.
Yeah, there's a big jumping one or something, isn't there?
Yeah, married to Natalie, and I've got 4 young kids, and so I guess like Greg, there's not a lot to be passionate about outside of caring for my family, but inside that, I'm passionate about giving them great food. So at the moment, I'm going through a bit of a sauce passion at the moment. So I'm trying to work on my sauces for dinner and for meats and stuff like that. And the other thing that I'm currently sort of getting into outside of church planting is cycling. I've been trying to find an exercise that I can do that sits alongside a busy family and a busy job that gets me travelling all around the country. And so I've just realised that I can ride 15 k's to work and I can ride home. But I started with an old beat up mountain bike, and now I want to go faster, and I want to stop getting taken over by the person on the road bike. So
do we have a photo of you with Lycra that we can show?
Yeah. How you done?
What about you, Greg? What do you do for exercise?
I'm a swimmer. I used to race push bikes very seriously, but there just reaches a stage where, as a middle-aged man, you want to stay away from tight-fitting clothes. So I actually do 5 swimming squads a week, which means we take all our clothes off.
All right, people haven't logged in to hear about Lycra, so let's move into actually why people have logged in, which is I want to hear about assessment. And again, people will be listening to this into the future because they're interested about assessment. I suspect that's because people are considering doing it. Now, before I jump to the first question we have a slide for, I just want to ask one other one, which is, Scott, how early should someone begin talking with Geneva about possibly doing an assessment? So say you're a church that's, Greg's church, thinking about starting a church next year, or you're a person who thinks, maybe after this assistant minister job, I'd like to consider whether church planting's for me. How early should they first get in touch with Geneva to consider the assessment process?
Yeah, I'd encourage a church and a potential church planner to get in contact 12 to 18 months out from thinking into a church plant. So if you have a set launch date in mind or a set starting point in mind, the longer lead time you have for planning, thinking, working out the who of who we're going to send and the what of what it might look like, the longer time you can have for that, then you just increase your ability to do that obviously better and with more resource and with more thinking. So if you're a mother church, then at least sort of 18 months to 24 months out, have the conversation with Geneva, see what resources are available. In terms of the potential planter, I'm in conversation with 21-year-olds. They won't probably plant a church for another 5 to 10 years. You can. I'm happy to come and have a coffee with you and talk about your passions, your ministry giftings, where you're at. Because what can be helpful is to think through.
There's two things that's just happened there. First of them is you've just dared a bunch of 18 to 21-year-olds to plant a church earlier than 5 to 10 years. And the second thing you've done is you've offered to shout a whole bunch of 18 to 21-year-olds coffee.
I'm happy to do both. I want to dare because awesome. I think what you want to be doing is actually then being intentional about what you're doing with the next 5 to 10 years. I can still remember as a 21-year-old at university sitting down and sort of working out a 5-year plan. Now, that seems a bit crazy, but what can you be doing to get to where you want to be? So what church do you go to? What training do you do? How do you think about where you might live? If you want to plant a church in Newcastle, living in Perth is probably not the best thing to be doing.
Awesome.
You want to be moving closest. So
So
you can
even if it's 5 years away for a person or for a church, there's no harm in them getting in touch, emailing info at Geneva Push or whatever, and starting to just begin talking and dreaming. No harm at all. But definitely 18 months out, that's definitely the time to do it. And this Geneva Push assessment is a conversation that can be had both with an individual pioneer, but also with a large church that's thinking of starting a church in the next suburb in a church hall. Either of those can be in touch. Awesome. All right then, Scott, can you please tell us about what should we expect from the assessment process? What's behind that door?
Yeah, so as I said, the assessment process, it's a process. So it's not, filling out an online questionnaire and kind of I'm done. It's often, a number of conversations with me and a number of conversations with the church that's going to be sending you out. It's filling out a whole bunch of documents. So I'll go through that, in a moment, and then it kind of culminates in a 3-hour interview, and then a report. It's a long process. Now you can do that as quickly as in 6 months or in 3 months if there's a tight time frame, or some guys take a longer 12 to 18 months. But I'd be encouraging most people to be getting that done as as quick as possible. So within sort of a 3 to 6 month window, rather than dragging it out. So what we expect? Well, the first slide I've got there is I guess how I think about a potential church planter. So what does it look like to lead a church plant? We're going to need to have a number of skills. You're going to need to be a Christian character, and then you need to have some detailed thinking into what is it that you want to achieve. So this slide here is from a great book on global church planting, and I guess one of the key things I'm asking is, and want to find out, is your conviction to plant. So I want to hear your desire. People know about Jesus and follow Jesus, with all their lives. I want to hear about your desire to reach a region. We've just heard Greg talk about Newcastle. 295,000 people who don't know Jesus and are going to go to hell. I want to hear, what is it that sits below, your motivations and your desires for the church planter. That's important, and I want to see that backed up by a church as well. The is of the church planting churches, of the church sending out, pioneer church planting leaders and teams of church planters. So I want to see that conviction, also confirmed by the local church. The second thing there is character, so that the spiritual life. I want to see someone who is praying about this. I want to see someone who is demonstrating, a growth in godliness and a growth in maturity. Both character and conviction, are vital. They're not just sort of things we test on the way through. We actually want to see someone love Jesus, and to that be seen in their marriage, in their parenting, in their relationships with friends, and in their relationships with not yet Christians as well. And then the third part is that competency word. So it's church planting skills. We're having a church planting assessment. We do think that there are some things that are different to starting a new ministry and getting something off the ground that are unique to a church planter. I'm not saying a church planter is special, or they're a Superman type Christian leader, but they do have some specific church planting skills that are going to help them.
I mean, you do that with a bass player for a church band. You do it with a grades 3 to 6 Sunday school teacher. You do it with a person who's going to read the Bible at the front of church, or a person on the welcome team, or evangelistic. All of those you're going to look for skills. It's not somehow making them some different category of Christian. It's just going, each of those different ministries has unique competency needs, doesn't it?
Yeah, exactly right. And so the helpfulness of the Geneva Push assessment process is, that it locks in on, what is it that you're going to need to plant a church? What is it that that'll be essential for you to start those things? The final thing and the reason I put this slide up is because Ott and Wilson and Alan Thompson raised the importance of personal and interpersonal abilities. And I think over the last sort of 6 years, one of the things I have seen is that church planting creates conflict. And so a church planter needs to be ready for it. They need to have, I think, greater communication skills, than the person who's coming to an established church, because so often, it requires you to be envisaging a group of people who you often don't know, and that's groups that are large and groups that are small. You can be across the table in a coffee meeting, trying to ask someone for a lot of money to sort of kick off your church, or you could be in a large church gathering with a whole bunch of people that you don't know, have a relationship with, again, asking them, to support you, pray for you to move to this city to start a new work. So I was looking for those three things. That's I guess the first place to start. And then let me talk through the process itself. So on the next slide there's a whole bunch of things that we collect before the interview. And so often the whole thing kicks off with either someone sending through hey, I want to plant a church, or I'm not sure if I'm a church planter, or I might have a conversation with a church leader who says, you really need to get in contact with this young bloke. He's got church planter giftedness all over, and I'd like you to meet up with him. I'll generally send out an online application, just a few pages, telling me a bit about yourself and answering a bunch of questions, which find out, I guess, how long away this church plan is, how much work you've already done, toward this potential new church off the ground. And a key part of that is also some self-assessment tools. So 2 or 3 years ago, we did some research with Lifeway Research in the United States to find out how and what makes tick an Australian church planner. Most of the questionnaires and the online stuff comes from the United States and North America. We've got a different context here. There's some obviously similarities, but we've got a different context. So I want you to fill out these sort of 3 tools: the church planner competency tool, and what this does is it gives us a snapshot of 35 key competencies. And really, I'm wanting to look at sort of 5 key ones. I want to see that you're emotionally resilient. I want to see that you can stand up to the pressure of knockbacks. How is it that you've responded to those things? I want to see that you're evangelistically optimistic. So what do you expect will happen when the gospel is preached? Do you expect people to be converted? You need to be inspiring. And what was interesting when we did the research was that you need to be inspiring if you're trying to plant a house church and have a simple church gathering, a gospel communities or a SOMA type role. You also need to be inspiring if you're going to plant an attractional church, a large church. Both categories will require you to get people excited and motivated on board. So you need to be inspiring. Every church planner needs to be a multiplier. I need to be thinking, how do I create paths into this church? How do I create paths where people grow in ministry? And so it's important. It's important that you multiply others. And so one of the tools that we use to sort of just get a snapshot of where you're at is a ministry systems tool. The ranking you see on the screen there in terms of 10% to 100% is not how it's not a raw score how good you are, but the closer you get to 100%, the more you've actually not only done a ministry, but you've raised up people in the ministry, trained, equipped them, and then handed that ministry over. So I'm not expecting a young bloke, to be, right at 100% on lots of competencies, and I'm not expecting an older guy who completes this either to, be, at a large level of competency for a whole number of regions. I want to see someone who's, worked in a couple of spaces quite well. They might have done a children's and youth role, and they might have demonstrated they can raise up leaders, train and equip them, hand over ministry. It might be in the small groups side of things. It could be a mission and outreach. They might be a beach mission leader. So what I'm wanting to see is that they've had that opportunity to raise people up, to envisage them, to plan, and then to evaluate, how they went at this ministry task. And then the final, one of the final ones is a risk factor analysis tool. And so I really say to guys as they're completing this, have this questionnaire open when if you're married with your wife. It has 20 questions that are really common sense. The unfortunate thing about common sense is that it's not quite common. So I would encourage them to have this questionnaire open, just be noting down some of the things that it asks. So if you look on the next slide there, you'll see that it looks into how much funding you have, your cultural background and the cultural background of the group or the community, the demographic you're trying to reach. What sort of experience do you have? What's your ministry experience? How many ministry partners? Have you got a large core team going with you, or are you going to be going with your wife and your 2 kids? and your dog. What pre-existing contacts do you have in the area? Have you been living in the community for a number of years, and so you already know most of the key leaders in the local community? You've already got established relationships in the local school, so that when you launch and have this public, church, there'll be a whole bunch of people who you can invite. There'll be a whole bunch of people who you've been praying for, and who you want to, get into this this disciple-making machine. And then finally, what sort of family support systems do you have? Often when I'm trying to work out someone's conviction in a plant, I'll ask them the question, have you thought about planning in a city, far away? So if they want to plan in Sydney, have you thought about planning in Perth, or have you thought about planning in Newcastle or the Gold Coast? I want to see that they actually are really committed to this area and this region. But I also want them to have their eyes lifted, to other parts of Australia that have potentially more needs.
We're not necessarily saying you have to have a low-risk church plant plan either, because it's possible that someone has one that for some of those reasons is low risk. They might have non-Christian families, both members of the couple, and they might be struggling to get the funding together, and it might be a big jump in terms of crossing cultural boundaries. But we'd again be looking for that to see that they're aware of that and have plans to mitigate those risks, or at least prepare for them. That's the kind of thing where, with any of this stuff, it's not as if you don't give the perfect answer, you're doomed. As far as Geneva's concerned, is it? It's rather the kind of thing of the more you've thought through that stuff and have factored that in, the more confident we'll be.
Yeah, this is an initial thing. So really, it's me also trying to work out, well, how much reading have they done? Have they just kind of heard about church planting yesterday, or have they been thinking of this for a number of years? Because obviously, the more that you do that, the better equipped and better prepared you are.
Awesome. All right, so let's move ahead to the next bit. So
we've done all those questionnaires. I've sat down with you and I said, great, I can see that you're convicted. You want to go ahead. So we'll then chase down some character references. So if you look on the next slide, we want to get a 360-degree picture of the church planter. So
360-degree means that you're asking people who lead you. We'll ask people who minister alongside you, friends and kind of partners in ministry, and then we'll also ask people you've led. It's that kind of idea of doing a full circle around you in terms of your involvement in ministry. That's the idea, right?
Yeah, that's the idea, exactly.
Yep.
And we want to hear from people who are going to be honest. We want to hear from people who know you and your marriage, if you're married. Now, that's a really helpful part of the assessment process. They're all confidential as well. So they're that means that, the people they're actually saying what they think about. Really helpful. Then we'll send out some husband and wife questionnaires. So we want to hear from you about your theology. We want to hear about your pastoral theology. We want to hear your testimony, and we also want to hear about a whole bunch of sort of confidential questions as well, your financial situation. These are all sort of pulled together again to be able to put in the hands of an assessment team, so that so they have a real big picture view of who you are. As part of that as well, we collect a couple of preaching samples, and also a planning plan. Now, the planning plan, doesn't need to be a 40-page, glossy prospectus. It can be, 2 or 3 pages that, simply just outline, who you're trying to reach, what are you doing in terms of mission planning, what's your expectation about growth, what's your funding plan, a whole bunch of questions. The wife question as well, again, goes into their testimony, who they are, and a whole bunch of questions about their support system. Again, their pastoral theology. We're basically, again, in both those tools, trying to find out, where you're at. It's not a test, but it's an opportunity to find out your thinking on, a whole bunch of questions that we think are really important for church planning.
So this is when that's all done together, that ends up being something that gets close to 100 pages or something, Scott, and it's something where you need to be prepared to spend hours doing that. People are often doing this late in their years at college, if they're at theological college, or while working in their secular work because they're planning to go out of that into church planting, or while doing an existing ministry where they're busy running the ministry they're already running. What's your advice there? And Greg as well, maybe you can comment on this. I guess this is a kind of a productivity question, but how do you actually make time for this non-urgent important thing of filling out this enormously irritating document? And if you're that kind of big picture thinker type people person, you just go, oh, forms, it's like that's the next installment of the Saw movies. This is just torture. You know, any advice on how to actually get around to filling it out, and any kind of traps you've seen people fall into where they get gridlocked in filling out this stuff? Either of you guys want to comment on that?
Yeah, I think one of the key things to do is just to make time to complete it. You know, so to block out a chunk of time. I'm going to spend 3 hours working on you know, a couple of sections of the husband questionnaire. I'm going to work on my planting plan, and that's going to involve, you know, going and have a conversation with a couple of people, or sitting down with my core team members to work out, you know, what this looks like, or with my senior minister or my senior pastor. The guys who actually complete it, you know, efficiently and effectively, they've actually made time. They've said, right, in 3 weeks' time, I'm spending 2 days going to work through this questionnaire, because you're looking at about, you know, depending on how much thinking you've done, you're looking at between sort of 10 to 15 hours of work.
Yeah.
That seems like a lot, but the aim again is so that we can put, you know, a good chunk of information in front of a group of people to make.
Greg, what about your thoughts, mate, in terms of that advice on getting the assessment stuff all done?
Yeah, I think whenever you've got a big job to do, the thing that helps you to get through it is seeing the value of it. And so even though there's a lot of work in it, everyone that I've spoken to who's ever filled one out has talked about 2 really big benefits. One was that it gave them clarity. So being forced to express things on paper gets it out of your head, and it helps you to see that you're not as thought out as you thought you were. And so it's not a hurdle to jump through in order to plant. It's actually a really helpful process for planting. And the other thing was, it draws other people in. So you're getting references, you're talking to your wife. This is actually building the team that's going to help you to plant. And so in each of those ways, knowing that it's not a hurdle but a helpful thing drives you to want to make time. But this isn't getting in the way of planting. This is actually moving you forward as a planter.
That's it. It's actually part of the test of, like, in a sense, your assessment's begun. I think Scott said this before the webinar began, you know, that in a sense we're testing you by seeing whether you can do hard work in forward planning and clarifying and articulating and stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, you're better equipped to plant once you've filled this in because of that degree of thoughtfulness and bringing people in.
And if you're an established church, or you know of established churches that are thinking of planting, go, we can't be bothered with the Geneva process, it takes too long, there's too many forms, we'll be fine without it. That in itself, I want to say, would be a warning bell for that established church. I think by sort of shortcutting this process, you're opening yourself up to risks and stuff like that. I guess one final quick thought on that before we move on to the next question, and that is, all 3 of us who are currently doing this webinar, as well as any Geneva Push planter that you can stalk down via the website and that you know of, any of us would be happy to help you, talk through with you, look at a draft version of your assessment documents if you want that help. So I guess that's an open invite. Ask people you know within the Geneva networks to actually help you and give you feedback. Let's move across to Greg, and you've done a bunch of these now, Greg. You've been a bit of battler in terms of doing lots of assessments over the last few years. What are you seeking to do in that whole assessment process? What are you looking for? What are you aiming for?
Yeah, I think we've found over the years that we find ourselves wearing 3 hats, and we didn't necessarily think this through from the beginning, but we've noticed over the interviews that we've done these 3 things that we as assessors find ourselves doing. The first one is, in that interview, we're actually just Christian brothers. So the Geneva interview is not like a secular job interview. You know, in a secular job interview, the assessor is asking what is best for our company, and that's not what we're doing. You know, we're thinking what's best for the kingdom, what's best for this person, and that means that it's kind of like any Christian conversation. You know, one of the big goals that we have is that the person walks out thinking that was a really encouraging experience as a Christian. And so during the interview, I want to make sure we actually spend some time dwelling on the gospel itself and the fact that we're saved and thanking God for it and rejoicing in it. We want to dwell on seeing Jesus work in their life. And it is a chance to look back sometimes on 20 years of them walking with Christ and Jesus transforming them. And that's a really encouraging thing. We want to encourage them to keep serving Jesus, and we want to pray with them. I think even if someone reached the point where they planted a church, if we hadn't done this, I'd feel a little bit like the interview was a failure, because it would have been a job interview rather than a Christian interview, if you get the distinction. So that's the first big hat that we've always found ourselves wearing. We're kind of brothers. The second hat that we've found ourselves wearing is we go into it really as a pastor and as a coach. Even though it's only 2 or 3 hours, it's 2 or 3 hours where you really can coach someone forward in their ministry, and they're going to get handed on to a coach later on. But I think one of the tests of someone who's any good at ministry is whenever they sit down with someone, they're going to find a way to coach them forward in the ministry that they're doing. And so at the end result of the interview, one of the things that we're looking for is whether this person plants a church or not, have we encouraged them just to keep giving their lives to gospel preaching? It might even be that we're saying, don't plant this church, but keep giving your life to gospel preaching in some other way. So part of that's been helping them to recognize their strengths over the course of the filling in the questionnaire. Some of the strengths that people didn't even know that they've had bubble to the surface. There's been a couple of interviews where guys have been there and they've come into the interview and they've actually been kind of diffident and lacking in confidence. And part of the interview has been to say, well, look at the track record of the things you've done here, and look at what your referees are saying about you. You really do have gifts in this area, and you mightn't think that you can do this, but look, you actually can. Part of it also, though, I think, is helping guys to see where other people, even their wife, can identify areas where they need to grow. And sometimes it's digging into that with people and saying, well, maybe you consider yourself to be an incredible preacher, but a couple of your referees have said this might require a bit of work. And so just as a pastor and as a coach, over those 3 hours or so, it's encouraging them in a thoughtful way to just keep on going as a gospel preacher. And I think the report helps to crystallize that. Then the third thing, and really I think this is the main hat we're wearing, is that we're assessing people for church planting. That is, there's a particular job that we want people to be able to do. And so by the end of the interview, as an interview panel, I want to have formed an opinion about them. I want to know whether or not we can encourage them off into planting a church, which means that really there's 3 kind of things that we dig into here in our interviews. What Scott was talking about earlier in terms of conviction, character, and competency. From the questionnaire and from eyeballing them and talking to them about the gospel and talking to them about their walk with Christ and talking to them about why they want to plant churches, I actually want to see that they've got a heart for this, that they really do believe it, because it's hard, isn't it? And
that's this is coming from people who've done church plants, who've experienced how difficult it is, and have seen other churches started and seen how difficult it is. If it feels like you're wanting to plant this church, and so you can't help but feel a bit like it's you versus the assessment team because you want to win. Yeah. But the assessment team is thinking what we want is you to go well, whether church planting or not. And so if it feels at some points like you might be being criticised or questioned by the assessment team, it's actually out of a love and a concern that this be the best thing for everyone rather than a desire to undermine you and your dream. And so that's
I think especially if you get the sense that from that first hat that the people sitting down with me, they're brothers and sisters. They love us. And they're asking hard questions that at some point someone's going to ask. So we might as well ask them and be asked them by people who love us and who are on our side. And so I do think a good interview has an element of challenge to it. Because let's face it, no one is that 100%er. We've all got areas of strengths and weaknesses, and we've all got things that we haven't thought through. So it's actually helpful for an assessment team to say, can you walk us through this? Explain this to us. And for us to be put in the spotlight a bit.
Excellent. I'm going to pause there, just conscious of time, and I just want to say to everyone that those who are listening right now, Yeah, you'll see like you've got your kind of slideshow, and then there's another little panel, go to webinar control panel. You can write questions in there, and we'll actually throw those to Scott and Greg. So if we've not covered the thing you actually wanted to know about, you jot in your question, and I'll be able to, and you can, if you want, say you want to hear from Scott or Greg or whatever, and then we can throw those questions to those guys. So please do use that, and you can take control of this second half of the webinar. But while you're doing that, let me go back to Scott, and can I jump ahead a slide, Ben, our slideshow organizer, to the 4 questions. Scott, and we're going to be talking about what things you can do to prepare for the assessment process. So that's just the next question along, the next slide along, Ben. I won't get Scott to speak to that, but there are 4 questions that assessors will be looking for. Can I trust you? Can I know where you're going? Can you take me there? What's my job? That's things to bear in mind. But I want to jump to the next bit. And Scott, could you talk us through this next slide? In preparing for the assessment, you need to realise what it is and what it isn't. Could you comment on that for us?
Yeah, so I think, as Greg's already said, it's not a job interview. So it's important to realise that you've got a number of guys in Christian ministry who want to see churches planted, and they want to see and make sure that this is the right thing for you and your wife, if that's applicable. So that's the first thing. The whole way you go into the actual assessment interview is vital to be thinking. You're not there trying to convince and try to argue your way into it. Really, you need to go in with the position. I want to find out if this is for us. So that means that you'll be honest, but you'll be open. That means that you'll trust these guys to ask the right questions to find out if this is for you.
And it's worth saying that even in a job interview, to be honest, but especially in this assessment process, defensiveness and trying to tell the assessors why they haven't quite understood, like that kind of getting defensive and self-justifying, and then even arguing with your wife or with your husband to try and put the best spin on you as a couple, that stuff doesn't actually help you in the process. It actually, that kind of harms you. It's far better to just be honest than to sort of try and sort of airbrush during the assessment. Isn't that a fair call?
Yeah, that's right. Church planting's hard work. Sort of 60% of church plants survive after 4 years. So there's 40% of church plants that don't continue. So it's hard work. You want to make sure that you're the right person for it. There was a young planter 5 years ago who I can remember didn't want to go through the assessment process because they were worried that they'd say no. In some ways, I'm wanting you to have that disposition towards the whole thing because your trust needs to be in God. Your trust needs to be that the Holy Spirit will convict people of their sin, and that He'll be at work changing people's lives as He works through you and your team and this church that gets on mission.
And so you reckon actually listening to church? Sorry, Greg, you go.
I reckon there's 2 ways you can respond to a challenge or a criticism. One is to be defensive, to say that the challenge was wrong, or you can show how you've wrestled with it and fixed it, that you've provided a solution for it. And really that's what you want in a church planner, isn't it? There'll always be criticism. Defensiveness and pointing the finger back rarely solves something, but someone who can say, I've addressed that question and I've worked at it, and here's the strategy. That's a really impressive thing, I think, in a candidate, but also in a church planter.
And often, it's a behavioural assessment interview, so we're looking at past behaviours. Past behaviours predict, future behaviours. And so if you can show and demonstrate why, well, you had this new ministry in the church and it completely failed, it didn't achieve any of its targets, it wasn't successful, that's a helpful thing to show. If you can demonstrate that you've learned from that, the changes you've put into your life, then that's what we want to see in an assessment interview.
We just as human beings and as assessors, we'll zone out, at various points, and stop listening so much, and that's going to be a reality when you plant a church. That as you preach, people will zone out, and so rambling, I think, is an issue for some of us. Those who have the gift of the gab, we talk and talk and talk. What are ways to make sure that actually that assessment time is not spent with lots of, talking, pitching, rambling, but actually having, preparing good answers? Is there any advice on how to actually prepare your answers so you can make the most of that time?
Yeah, so I think one of the helpful things is to, in terms of being as prepared as possible, is to, I guess, listen to church planning stories, so that in your head you'll have, I guess, a whole bunch of questions that you're asking, and also a whole bunch of data and things to sort of wrestle with, that'll no doubt come out in the interview process. So know your planting plan, know your demographic, know your story, and tell it, succinctly and quickly, knowing that your life kind of, rests on it. But there'll be time obviously to spend, going deeper, and answer the question. I mean, one of the things that's really important is, listen to the question. Don't kind of second guess why they're asking that question. Behind that question, is there a question, and are they asking that question so they can get to that? Just answer the question.
Great.
Building that trust.
Now, one big thing in terms of preparation, and this is a big, obvious thing that people may not do but really ought to do, is if you're married, you need to sit down and talk in detail before the assessment itself. So, Greg, what are some of the things that you're looking for in that area of interviewing the husband and wife together?
Yeah, because the thing to realize is that the two of them, if you're married, you're both in the interview, and it's not that the wife is a spectator, she's a real participant. For us, there are a bunch of, I guess, more common or lesser questions that we're asking that you would expect to be asked in most ministry interviews. So we're looking to see how they both feel about the state of the marriage. Do they both feel like it's going well? I want to get a sense of the history of the marriages, where their crises, what got them into the crisis, what got them out of the crisis, what have they learned? I want to have a bit of a chat about how the husband has gone as he's progressed in ministry and taken on more responsibility and so on. How has that impacted the marriage? Has he ended up neglecting it? Is the wife sitting there panicking because she's thinking she's going to be neglected for the rest of her life? I want to also get a sense for how realistically they perceive each other. So sometimes you want your marriage partner to be your best support and cheerleader, but sometimes we can be blind. And that's actually an unhelpful thing. So do they realistically perceive each other? I think they're pretty common questions. There's one question that we've found really helpful to keep digging into, and it's a slightly subtle question, but it's, with the guy and his wife, have they worked out what it means for her to be his suitable helper as a church planter? I think some of the things, sometimes you hear a wife saying, he's going to go into ministry and I'm going to support him, which sounds really good, but it can actually be a way of the wife kind of staying at arm's length. That this church planting gig, that's his thing, and I've still got my life and my goals. And there are ways in which the husband and wife, they're pretty different. He's the one who's the pastor of the church. He's the one who's going to be employed. He's the one who's going to be doing the preaching and the leading, and often, especially in those early days, the wife is going to be with small children. Her ministry is going to be quite intensive rather than extensive. So they're going to have quite different roles, but there are some things that we really want to see them be on exactly the same page about. And one of them is, we obviously want them to have the same gospel convictions. She's got to love Jesus like he does, but we also want to see them have the same convictions about the church plant. That is, it's not that it's his plant and she's supporting it. I want to see that they're actually loving this and doing it together. It's her church as well, and that she's passionate about doing it. Different role, but she's just as passionate about doing it, so that as her role shifts, her core convictions about it are going to be exactly the same.
It's interesting. You talk about the church, don't you, Scott, about, it's not Scott, Greg, the other one. You talk there when you bring staff on that they may be employed to begin with for a particular role, but ultimately they're being employed to the ministry, to the team, and the role may change. And that's the same thing, isn't it? That's exactly the same thing with the husband and wife in the church planting. They're going into it together for the cause of the church plant. Now, her particular involvement may go from hyper involved early on, if there are no kids at that stage, to suddenly less directly involved but still owning, that might shift over time.
That's exactly right.
I work with a woman here whose husband owns a local boutique cafe called Yellow Bernard, and the way Lyndall speaks about that cafe is always we love it, this is what we're doing, you know, and so that's, you know, in kind of just a business context, the same kind of spirit, you know, that that they as a couple are owning that and all the sacrifices that go with starting a small business, and on just a human level, a church plant is quite similar to that. It's very invested, 24/7 sort of thing.
There can be dangers with it. So I think sometimes there can be a bit of a blurring. So the wife begins to see her role as being the pastor when it's not. He's the one. But I reckon you kind of see this. This really bites when things get hard. So let's say, for instance, that the ministry does go badly, that the plant fails. The wife can end up thinking, he dragged me into this, and he's ruined my life. And this is all his fault. Whereas you kind of want her to say, you want both of them to say, we decided to do this together, and we both made real adult choices. And in fact, when things go hard, it can then be the wife who keeps the husband powering on. That was the case for us in 2010. We had a really horrible year. It was the worst year of our lives, really. And every day I wanted out of the ministry. Every day was a conscious thought. But Emma was the one who kept saying, we're in this together. And that sense of solidarity, even with different roles, I think is really powerful. And if it's missing, it's a really big flaw.
Yeah, that's great. All right, we're going to flip across to questions now. I've got a question here from Steve, but again, if others listening in have questions, directions they want to take it, things that they, you know, found a bit surprising or offensive, they want to clarify, you know, whatever it is, then we'd really love to address your particular question, so shoot them through. This is a question from Steve that I'm going to throw to you, Greg. So Steve makes the observation that in the Great Commission, the mandate is given by the head of the church, Jesus Christ, for all believers. This responsibility is given to all receive the Holy Spirit in Acts. And the first historical example of planting churches indicate that a few who were called were set apart by the Holy Spirit and the local church for the task. So that's the kind of, given these things, Steve is saying. How does Geneva Push, a para-church organisation with an assessment system, how does Geneva Push fit into that biblical description of local churches sending out people authorised by the Spirit? Is there a conflict there? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, so I'll be interested to hear what Scott's got to say because he's more integral involved, but here is my take on it. Geneva isn't the authoriser. It's not the police. It's not the government. It's the enabler. And so, yeah, you still want the local church to be setting guys aside and coming up with the dream and recruiting and doing all of those things. I think what Geneva Push does is add expertise and people to make that better. And so this isn't an authority, that's a support, is how I see it.
It's a bit like Sunday school doesn't train kids in theology and discipling. The family does it, and they use Sunday school to supplement that, you know, or we're all homeschoolers. It's just we might use different tools to, you know, supplement that. And then theological colleges aren't responsible for the theological education and training of ministers. They supplement the leadership development of the local church with expertise. And so, yeah, Scott,
that's exactly right.
Yeah, I guess my response would be that the local church and the local church leadership and the body are integral to the whole assessment process. So, as I said at the start, you know, we want to, from the very start, we're asking that question: what does your church think about this? What's their support? Are they going to send people? Are they, do they think that you're a church planter? We want to hear my character references about, about you, the church planter, and about your marriage, so that they're integral to understanding whether or not you've got the, you've got what it takes to start a church. But also, we would always encourage, at the completion of the assessment process, the planter to, hand that report over. It's their report, it's their confidential report. But we'd say, hand this over to the church leadership and have a discussion about next steps and about the way forward. We want to work alongside local churches so that, as Greg said, we can do it better with better expertise and better resource.
That's one side of Steve's question. The other side is the authorising power of God the Holy Spirit. So, Greg, how do we see many ways in which God the Holy Spirit works, authorises, appoints, empowers. What's the standard New Testament teaching on how the Holy Spirit equips someone for Christian ministry and leadership? How do we identify his work?
I think you kind of see it in a couple of ways. So one is in books like 1 Timothy and Titus, Paul tells Titus to go and appoint elders. That is, it's not that the Spirit is at work apart from human agency, and yet in Acts 20, the Holy Spirit has made these people overseers, and so I think you're looking at both of those together. I wouldn't say that when a church puts forward a young planter, that's just a human point of view. Whereas a guy who stands up and says, no one has actually encouraged me to do this, but I really feel like the Spirit's pushing me forward, I'd be nervous about that. I think the way the Spirit tends to move people into leadership is through the church that he saves us into. And it doesn't mean that we end up with this kind of dominant, that the church is the only one who can affirm someone, but it means that the church is actually a really quite reliable way. The people who know us and who do ministry with us and that God has given us as apostles, prophets, evangelists, and pastors and teachers, that's a pretty reliable way of knowing whether or not someone is suitable for ministry. And yet sometimes we had a guy who we hadn't necessarily been kind of looking to plant a church, and he went off and did some great evangelism, and a church just sprung out of it. At that point, the Holy Spirit was a lot smarter than we were, and we looked back at it and said, well, that's awesome. But by and large, I think you're going to see the Spirit at work through the church in its leadership, appointing and bringing people on. I think that's a normal way.
Great. Scott, here's a question for you. If someone's going through the assessment process and for whatever reason at the end of it, they really feel like they, were not just, felt rattled and frustrated and hurt on that kind of personal level, but actually feel there was a sort of an injustice there, that maybe they suspected that maybe the assessment team hadn't read the documents properly, or were distracted during the interview, or just the outcome they really just didn't think was fair, and maybe you go back to a mentor who encouraged you to get assessed and the mentor agrees with you and says, yeah, I don't think that's fair. Is there any recourse, or is there any precedent for someone being able to actually kind of appeal the outcome of their assessment process?
Yeah, there is. I mean, always welcome feedback, and always, we'll always call every assessed person afterwards and spend, a few hours talking through the process, what they found helpful, next steps. Also, at the end of every process as well, the assessment team leader will also call up the person and make sure that they, understand what's been said in the letter and it's clarified. So there's a lot of opportunities in the process itself to, clarify misunderstandings, or work out, what is actually was meant there. You said in this area of growth that I needed to do X, Y, Z. What did you mean by that? What can I do? So as Greg said, we want to use it as a growth tool. We want to use it as something that actually helps you, think into the next steps with church planning, but also next steps in how you can be useful in seeing the kingdom, grow across Australia and the world. We've had one instance where we've repeated the assessment with a whole other team. Sometimes it is a 50-50. It's very hard to work out, whether this thing, should be a yes or should be a no. I guess it's important to realise as well, the assessment outcome, it's not just a pass or fail. There are 4 outcomes there. Recommended, which means we think you've got the gifts and skills necessary to plant a church, go for it. Recommended with conditions, which is kind of like an amber light. You've got the skills and the gifts, but there's just a few areas that you're going to need to work on. It might mean getting more experience. It might mean finishing up, college, or could be, working out in more detail the plan and the next step. The third one is a strong potential. So we see that there's significant, concerns about, who you are and where you're at the moment. That you need to actually put a stoplight on this for a time. Generally 2 to 3 years. So it's not, a simple thing that you can work out. It actually requires a lot more maturity and a lot more work than just 6 to 12 months of wrestling. And then the final one is not recommended. And not recommended is you're not suited at all for ministry, but you're not suited for church planning ministry. And the tone and the report will help you think through next steps and how you can be useful. So as I said, there's been one instance where we've repeated the assessment process with a whole other team, and I think that was helpful. The time in between for the planner between that first interview and the second interview, they're able to work on a number of areas that were raised in the first interview process, and they were actually able to enter into the second assessment interview, I think in a more prepared way, which helps change the outcome. The reality as well is it might take 12 to 18 months to get over an assessment interview in terms of the pain and the grief and the hurt of someone saying, actually, we don't think this is for you. And I think that's hard and that's tough, but it's going to be more costly to find that out, maybe 5 to 10 years down the track after, investing hundreds of thousands of dollars, after having moved your family, after having, fired up a whole team of people, and then to see this thing fail or this thing not work because you didn't take the time, to listen to, assessment feedback, an assessment tool. That's what I'd say. It's a very relational process. I'm more often than not now not involved in the assessment interviews because I'm so for the planter that I can't see, I can't be objective in the assessment interview now. So I want to hand it over to another team so that they can, have fresh eyes on this assessed couple and this opportunity, and see it, without my lens. That is, I so want to see more churches started. I so want to also see, young guys and old guys, plant churches that are.
Can I drill it down to a little detail question? I'll throw this to Greg. One of the things that I think is very hard if you haven't done it before, that you're forced to do with these assessments, is write these plans of what you will do. And that feels like, especially if you're, newer in the ministry thing, it feels a bit abstract and pointless. You kind of go, well, I don't know what I will do because I'm going to wait to see what God will do. And everything I've done before in ministry is you kind of feel your way forward and you intuit what's next and you brainstorm it. And yet now you're asking me for a plan and setting growth projections and budgets and what I will do to raise up leaders. And I don't even have a core team yet and all this sort of stuff. Any advice on can you relate to that, Greg? And any advice on how you do that sort of that artificial exercise of trying to write a detailed plan of what doesn't even exist yet?
Yeah. I think especially if you are the big picture person with a high ambiguity tolerance, and someone says, so what are you going to do? And you say, I'm just going to go and plant a church. We're going to talk to people and preach the gospel. The thing is, reality crashes in on the first Monday morning when you've actually got to fill your time. And you've got to have a strategy for who you're going to meet with and how you're going to do it. And so recognizing that you can't put your church plan into concrete, you do have to have something in pencil at least. Otherwise, you're actually not going to spend your time in any kind of worthwhile way, which means that you're going to be wasting people's money and you're going to be wasting the time of the people you've invited with you. And so I think for your sake, for the kingdom's sake, getting certain plans of this is what we are going to do. Here are the projects we're going to launch. Here are the people I'm going to meet with. Here are the people I'm going to look to try and evangelize so that I know how my time is going to be filled is powerfully helpful. I've got a lot of sympathy for the high ambiguity tolerance person. That's me all over. Now I've come to see that ambiguity can actually slow you down and it can hurt people because they have all these different expectations that you're not going to meet because you didn't even think it through.
And a simple way to start with that can be as simple as actually early on in the assessment process, asking Scott, asking me, asking Greg, asking another Geneva planner or church planner to say, can you give me your plan? And can I copy and paste it and tweak a pre-existing thing? That's allowed. That's the normal thing, and it can be a variation of someone else rather than having to start with a blank piece of paper. That's excellent. Scott, any closing? What's the next action? We've got a bunch of people listening in, a bunch of others will listen on the podcast, and in future months or years, if Jesus doesn't return, if there was kind of one sort of a call to action you'd want to be sending out to our listeners, what would it be?
One of the simple things they can do is jump on this website. The New South Wales Presbyterian Church have created a real simple, free assessment tool. It's 20 questions. So this website here, and we'll put a link up as well when we send out the resource to this. Fill it out, and reflect on it with with your church leader. It asks the key questions that you probably need to be thinking about yourself. See what the score comes up with. I did it the other day with a group of students down in South Australia. I got a 70, which said, maybe you should think hard about planning a church. And it's helpful. I mean, I know White gave me that result, so that's okay. But it's a helpful tool to just start that process on. The other thing is send me an email. So scott.s@genevapush.com, scott.s@genevapush.com. As I said, I'd be more than willing to grab a coffee and start the conversation. It's not too early to start the conversation, and it's also not too late if you feel like you're heading down that track and you're about to church mate, you haven't done an assessment, you haven't got organised. It's not too late. Come and give me a yell, and we can see how we can help.
Over to you, Ben.
Thank you so much, gentlemen. Wow, the A to Z of assessment. I wasn't sure if you're going to be able to cover it all, chaps, but you certainly did. Thanks for that. As we mentioned at the start of the webinar today, we have been recording this, and we are going to make a link to the recording available in the next couple of days. As Mikey's mentioned several times, this is definitely something that, as you were furiously taking notes on, you're going to want to go back to, revisit, take more notes, and share it around with anyone that you know who is really interested in getting involved in the assessment process here at Geneva. Now, before we let you go, just a couple of announcements to fill you in on about what's coming up here at Geneva, including the next webinar. The next webinar is going to be on the perils of PKs, which is the perils of parenting pastors' kids, as well as nurturing their faith. That's happening on the 3rd of September. Al Stewart's going to be talking to Kathy Tucker and her son Luke Tucker, mother and son, talking about these perils of PKs and how that happens, how you get into that in the church planning landscape. So go to genevapush.com to register for that. And before we sign off, a really quick thanks again to those that sponsor the webinar. Thank you so much to EA Insurance for all your insurance needs on church planning. Go to ea.org.au, and Christian Super for all those super needs in the church planning universe. Go to christiansuper.com.au. On behalf of our host, Mikey Lynch, and our great guests this morning, our expert panel on assessment, Scott Sanders and Greg Lee, and the whole Geneva team, I'm Ben McKecken. Have a fantastic day, and we will see you at the next Geneva Push webinar.